Welcome to Chasing Hard podcast, where we talk about trusting God when life doesn't turn out the way we planned, which is not always easy to do because we encounter hard things along life, things we didn't ask for, things we don't feel equipped to handle, things that we would never raise our hand and say, "Hey, sign me up." And so today I am excited to talk with Heather Adams. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Lori. It's so great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. I did a little snooping online, and I do know that, okay, so we can do that. I know that you have a ministry
Yes.
called Worship Walk Ministries.
That's correct. Yeah.
That's and I noticed you have quite a few things surrounding worship.
Yes. That's really been at the heart of my heart for a lot of years. I ended up on the worship team. That's where the first place I learned what some people call worship.
Right.
But it's since expanded, in my view, to include a lot of other things too. And that led me to write a book about, in fact, what King David talked about in terms of worship, which was pretty cool to come across. And I can talk more about that if you'd like. But I feel like worship is kind of at the basis of everything I do or try to do in life. And things always seem to come back to that. Am I worshiping? Am I giving God worship every day? Am I giving him the glory every day?
So worship is not just about the music or the songs we sing at the service. Worship is our different acts that we do daily just to honor God. Or why don't you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think you put it really well. The basis of the book was coming across a passage that King David expressed to his worship leaders at the temple, talking about different acts of worship. And I just kind of latched onto a little term. I called them worship action words, because they were verbs that he used, like bring him glory, cry to him, call out to him. And you can read them and think that those are very highfalutin things that you would just do in the temple. But it occurred to me that he really wants us to do that all the time. And those are things we can do all the time. And every day can be filled with little acts of worship. And
that's good.
And they're not little to him if we're doing them with the right heart.
Exactly. Because I like that, because God is a heart God, and he looks at our heart. And sometimes we forget that, I think.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, and I know I saw several of your books. How many books have you written?
Right now, just the one. I've written an ebook that's online as well.
Okay. Yeah. Are you working on another one, or?
I've kind of been circling around working on a second one. I haven't really been able to settle honestly on the format of it yet. But so I'm kind of in the works with it. The second book I'd like to write. I think it kind of makes sense for me to continue writing devotionals.
So you know the premise of the podcast. And I just opened it up with, we encounter things that we don't want to go through. And so I feel like just even in talking about worship and how small acts in our heart leads me to think that you, because you're human and you've lived a few years, have encountered some hard times in your lives where you even feel like God has called you to them, even though you don't like them. And let me just preface that. We were talking the other day with just a group of us about suffering, and do Christians suffer well? Or do we even talk about suffering? And I say, no, we don't. And I say that I'm in the dark. I don't know what's wrong with my lighting. I'd say that for a lot of Christians, not all Christians, they feel like being a Christian makes them exempt from the suffering. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. I think that's the hope of a lot of Christians, that once you accept Christ, things will magically get easier. And I think that was one of my hopes, honestly. I was a little naive about that when I accepted Christ. And I accepted him at a later age, too. And I'd gone through a lot of stuff. And I kind of reached that point of, I just can't do it. I can't figure this out. And God, I hate to say last resort.
Mm,
God was a last resort, but it was, I had tried other things first on my own.
okay.
And so I think there was this hope embedded in there because I'd started to get to know Christians who were peaceful. They had a calm about
Mm,
them. They
mm,
had a sense of joy about them, and I wanted that.
right.
And I thought that naively, again, I thought that accepting God was, you're going to get that joy.
Right.
It's going to happen right away. And I didn't understand what the joy was at the time. I think I was confusing it with happiness.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've learned personally, and I'm still learning it, is that when you go through hard times, that's a wonderful opportunity to learn what real joy is about.
Mm-hmm.
If you do what God wants us to do when we
Yes.
have those hard times.
Right.
And that is one of the hardest lessons. And we
Yeah.
have to keep learning it over and over. I
No,
know
you're
I do.
right. I mean, I think that's probably the essence of life.
Mm-hmm.
It is, and it goes along with the worship because we get to choose, and even in our actions and how we respond to the situations that we encounter,
Right.
will we choose to trust God, to go with God, bringing honor and glory to Him, and still not like what we're going through, because those two things can and do coexist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have lived that out
Mm.
firsthand in a lot of ways, but especially with rheumatoid arthritis. I was diagnosed about 8 years ago with it.
Mm.
And it's been a long road of learning how to walk in it and walk in it well,
Mm.
in terms of how I'm behaving, how I'm thinking about it, and just accepting that I'm dealing with it.
Right.
Um, that's been a really hard thing because sometimes God puts us in these places. Like, as you say wonderfully, you don't want to be there and you wouldn't sign up for it.
Mm.
And God allows it
Yes.
and He refines you through it.
Yes.
And sometimes it takes longer than other times to let Him do the refining.
Right.
But for me, the rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis was the start of a really long journey of allowing Him to work in me through having that condition.
Oh, that's a big deal
Yeah,
because
yeah,
that's painful
right,
physically, and it's
right.
a reminder that you get often, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, yeah. Um, it's challenged me in a lot of different ways, and any chronic illness does this. Any
Sure.
illness does this, where you're challenged not just physically, but emotionally and
Mm-hmm.
mentally and spiritually. I found as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a real opportunity. In my best days, I
Opportunity.
call it an opportunity for me to let Him in and to really, as you say, trust and
Mm.
to lean on Him for what I need rather than to try and manufacture it myself.
I'm thinking about a situation of some friends that go to our church, and they're walking through a hard time physically,
Mm-hmm.
with one of their adult children. She just turned eight. No, she didn't just turn 18, but she just went away to college across
Mm-hmm.
the country, and some physical things started happening, and she ended up being in the hospital for a month, and then had her colon removed.
Wow.
So they flew her back home, and she ended up being back in the hospital, but I think she's stabilizing. But I'm thinking, as you're talking, it's one thing for us to have fully developed human brains, whether I'm always thinking correctly or not. But for an 18-year-old who seriously has just started their life,
Mm-hmm.
how do you even cope and deal with that? Like, I know she's going to be up against huge challenges in her faith.
Yep.
That would be difficult for even a more mature person in age. How,
Mm-hmm.
like, do you think, and I don't know how old you are, I'm not assuming you're old at all, but like, if you were at that age, that would be more
Mm-hmm.
difficult for you to come to terms with.
I think it would. I mean, for myself, it's a hard comparison because I was not a Christian back at
Okay.
that age, and I did not grow up in a Christian household. But I'm thinking about my own children if they
Yeah.
were that age.
Yeah.
And the thing that I would be grateful for in that moment is that we had a family of faith.
That's cool.
meaning our family biologically, but also a church family. And once you get that prayer team started, whoever they are on a particular prayer, in a church or a family or whatever, I think that activates something in the spiritual realm right away. And I think that it's almost like an umbrella that we can open up to put our children or people who are not as farther along in the faith under.
Yeah.
And they can kind of, if they can huddle under that for a little while,
Yeah.
until they're able to stand a little more steadily on their own.
Yes. And then too, to watch your child struggle. I mean, you just mentioned you have children. Same. Adult children for me. I just can't even imagine as a parent. Like, I know it wouldn't, because of all the things that I've been through in my personal life, it wouldn't hinder my faith at all, because the older I get, the less I know about lots of things, but the more I trust God, because I don't know the answer to lots of things. So that it wouldn't hurt my faith or hinder my faith, but it's my kid suffering.
Yes. Absolutely.
Watching them struggle with it, and not being able to help them come to a place that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've gone through things with our kids where I've felt so protective that I wanted to fix it for them. And it's been a challenge for me to say, no, it's not up to me to fix it. It's up to God. It's up to God to reach them, and they're on their own journey. So it's a separation thing too. So there's a lot of layers to it.
You're right. Absolutely.
And when it's your child, of course, the mother-child thing is so strong, that bond. It's hard. And I give thanks all the time that our God is so big. Amen. That he can handle all of that, and he wants to handle all of that. And he knows our everyday comings and goings, and he knows our thoughts. And to me, that's a comfort.
Yes.
When I first became a Christian at 30, I was older, and I kind of got a little spooked by that verse in Psalm 139. About exactly. And my comings and goings, and I can't hide from you, basically. Yeah. And at first it was like, right, exactly. But now I find so much comfort in that, because you can come to God with anything at any time, even if it's like a blob of feelings. You can come to him. Yes. And he knows what you're talking about. Yep. And the Holy Spirit will come right in and meet you there. Right. And to me, that's such a comfort. And so many nights with our kids, when they've gone through things, or when I've gone through a flare of RA, I lean onto that thought and that scripture a lot. I love that. So you just use the word a flare. So it flares up. You're not always in pain. I don't know a lot about rheumatoid arthritis. I know that I have arthritis in my toe and arthritis in my back, and every now and then it hurts. That's all I really know. Well, rheumatoid is a tough one, because it's different in every body. Okay. It's a very personal disease or condition, whatever you want to call it. Right. And so for everybody, it's you need a little bit different mix of medications that work for you. And there's a lot of trial and error sometimes to find that. But yeah, the flares are tough, because they come out of nowhere sometimes. And that I call them random, because you don't always know what's going to spark one. Really? Sometimes it's when you're not feeling well, like if you're getting a cold or something, it can spark that in you. Or if you're just tired, it can spark it in you. Or if you overdo, you know. So for me, I've just been through a year of not having been able to get some medication that I had been on that had worked really well. So it was another whole year of leaning on God, saying, okay, God, you're doing something here. Wow. So I'm back on it now, but I've been very blessed in that pretty quickly I got diagnosed with it. There are some people who've gone for years and haven't known what it is. And I did not go that long. And I've gotten the medication, or I got a good combination of medications pretty quickly. Right. So I was pretty, that's pretty flexible. I was pretty able to do a lot of what I normally did. But over the last couple of years, for different reasons, I've been having a lot more flares.
Mm.
So it's been a process of just saying, okay, here it comes, or okay, here it is. And just really stopping, not trying to push myself and going right into prayer, as well as trying to do what I can for myself.
Right.
But knowing that if I get tense, if I get anxious, if I get upset, it's going to make it worse, as you would imagine. So it's reaching out to God for calming my spirit, number one, but number two, for reminding me that he knows.
He knows. I do love that.
Yeah, he's not giving me anything more than I can handle, and it's going to pass. So
Mm.
it's a lot of training he's been doing in me about disciplined thinking. It doesn't sound fun to say
Nope.
disciplined thinking, because you want to go out and play.
Yeah.
But discipline can really just be such a blessing when you hit times like that, because otherwise I would go willy-nilly into my emotions. And that's how I lived a lot of my life, was emotion based and not being centered or grounded.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of what worship has done for me, and what a lot of the refining that he's done for me through this, is teaching me how to be grounded and centered in him, not in my own strength.
Right.
And knowing that he's there, knowing that the scriptures are still true. The promises are still for me.
Yes, absolutely.
Whether I feel it or not, and that he's right with me, whether I feel it or not in any given moment.
That's really, I think a lot of us do get hung up on our emotions, and they do dictate. And so we feel like this might not be right, this might not be God, because of some emotion. And emotions are fickle, like they don't last. I don't know why we're so afraid of emotions, I mean, even happy emotions, they don't last either. So we in our Western society, in America especially, tend to be very emotion based, and Christians as well, I think. Yeah.
And if you look around at a lot of churches, that can be the case. I mean, in the churches I've been in, I'll speak for myself. The churches I've been in, you meet people who are all along that spectrum. And I was in that spectrum. When I first became a Christian, it was all emotion. I brought that in from the world. And so I've gone through a kind of a 180 on that, in terms of thinking as well as feeling, and knowing, as you say, the feelings are there. And God gave us feelings, so there's nothing wrong with them.
Not at all.
But they're not necessarily the best thing to lean on to guide us.
Yeah, I like that. That's true, because they're not, God did give us our feelings, and so they're important. But they're not the end all be all that we have to, we don't, our measure of anything.
Right.
So anything else that you've had to walk through hard times, that you, like, if you had to talk to somebody right now, that you would want to tell them based on your experience? And
well, the other thing that came to mind when you had asked me about sharing something was the journey I've had since I've been here. I'm living in South Carolina now.
Okay.
I lived most of my life in Connecticut, and our children, we raised our children there, my husband and I. And 4 years ago, we decided to move down to South Carolina. We wanted to get where it was warm. And
does that help with the rheumatoid arthritis?
It can.
Okay.
With me, it can be a little bit iffy in terms of humidity. And if there's a lot of storms around, barometric pressure can have an effect on things too. So, but it's anywhere we go, there's going to be some marker that I have to be aware of. So I'm grateful for the warmth, because that really does make a difference. And having it be in the 60s as opposed to the 30s, I'll take that.
Amen.
So we moved down about 4 years ago. And at the time we moved, our daughter stayed in Connecticut where we had been living. And my son had just entered the Air Force, and he was being sent to Germany. And so we kind of, I think of it as kind of spokes in a wheel. We just kind of went off in different directions.
Right.
And I did not realize how fully I had wrapped myself around my kids in terms of identity and purpose and all that, until we moved down here. And there's no bungee cord long enough to stretch between Connecticut and South Carolina, or Germany and South
Germany,
Carolina,
yes,
for that
yeah,
matter.
yeah.
So it's been a process for me again, and it's the time as well. It's the transition time where they are in their mid-20s. They don't need a mommy
Right.
anymore. They want a mom, and they want
Yes.
a friend, an advisor, whatever you want to call it. But they don't want that mommy. They don't
Right.
want me to run in and fix and rescue and all that. And there was part of me that still wanted to do that.
Yes.
And that was really hard to give up.
Yes.
And that was another area where I really had to finally just say, okay, Lord, I can't stop doing this without your help. And again, it's been that process of saying, it's okay. God has your kids, number one. But number two, God has you. And there's more for you in life beyond what you've done.
Yeah.
So it's been a real kind of flipping of my script personally, in a good way.
That's good.
But,
and I go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it all kind of revolves back to, am I me-centered or am I God-centered? Am I waiting for him to tell me what I can do for him, or am I still trying to grab for what I had before that is outdated now? Because he always wants the best for us, but the best for us is not always what we would pick to do.
Yes, so many things right there we could talk about. And I do agree. My kids are all, my youngest is 27, my older two are young 30s. But so you would think I would know this a little more, but it's still peeling back the layers of how, because I loved that period of my life. Like, I loved their growing up years. I loved the teen years. I loved it all. I would go back there in a minute, but I know that's over, even though I don't know how it went so quickly. And how do you, and I love watching their adult lives, and I love seeing where God is taking them and what they're doing, but it's still been very difficult to transition from that part of my heart, my whole life for that amount of time. And it's a deal. It's a hard thing. I know.
And it's hard to talk about without getting a little misty when we talk about it, because it's such a meaningful time in our lives and a meaningful job, really.
For sure.
In the best sense, a job. Ministry. It's really ministry.
It really is. You're right. I want to thank you for birthing someone who's serving our country. So thank you to your son. That's quite an honor. I can't imagine Germany. I live in Kentucky. So my youngest moved to California 2 years ago. And I can't imagine, that's across the country. I can't imagine out of the country. Like,
oh my gosh. Yeah. That was a tough one.
I'm still navigating. How do you have a relationship? Because at first I was like, okay, we just got to figure out how to include him in our lives, but long distance. And then I figured out, I can't. Like, life changed, and we have to find new ways of doing things. And we're not gonna fit him in, though we connect with him. It's hard.
It is hard. And boy, that first Christmas, I was really struggling to get stuff to him on time. I was being all sentimental, and I thought, I'm going to send him his old stocking and I'm going to fill it with stuff. And I didn't get it into the mail in time. It got there the day before Christmas, and he wasn't even, I wanted to surprise him. So I didn't tell him about it, and he didn't think about it going to the mail until the day after Christmas. That was just a comedy of errors thing. But it was just thinking that different way about it. Like, I can't just send him something and I know it's going to get there in 2 days. And that's a little thing, but just realizing that distance is there. But then you think about, when am I going to see him next? And we can see him online, of course. And
that's great. That's awesome, but it's not the same.
Exactly. And I want to hug him. I want to, whatever. The tactile.
Yes.
And with our daughter too, being in Connecticut when we're here, it's lovely that she's there and she's really doing well, and I'm thrilled for her. But it's like, Oh, it'd be so great to see her every whenever.
Yeah.
But you're exactly right. It's adjusting to a new way of being together and having that be okay.
Right.
Um,
Well, I love the things that you're sharing and saying because they resonate with me, and I know with a lot of listeners as well. It looks like though we need to wrap it up.
okay.
Is there anything? I know you talked about a couple of big things.
Hmm.
Any particular thing that you would just in your parting words that you would say to someone on either of those subjects that you brought up, or anything in particular?
Well, I think in terms of going back to worship for just a minute, because this all kind of comes under the heading of that, really, if you want it to. Whatever we're dealing with in life, I've written some articles. I write for a couple of Christian websites, and I get comments sometimes from people, and they're sharing their hearts with me, which I so appreciate. And it's a
Yes.
blessing to hear from people. And I'm always touched by the fact that they want to be closer to God. It's not a matter of, gee, I just wish this would go away. It's I'm really struggling with this, and I want to know God is there, but it's really hard to know He's there. And for me, I can really relate to that because I felt that way, especially, the RA and the other things. But what I found is that if I set aside time, and it doesn't have to be a lot of time, but if I set aside time every day, even 5 minutes, to just sit and thank God and be with Him and say, I love you. You're amazing, or whatever adjective you want to say or share, or just ask Him a question, um, pour out your heart, whatever it is you need to do. It's all good. And He wants to hear all of it. And it really will bring us closer. It feels like 5 minutes a day is not going to do it, but 5 minutes will grow because you start doing that, and you start noticing a change, and it will grow in itself. And that's, to me, where my worship life really started to bloom, is when I made that dedicated time to just give Him myself.
Yeah.
So I would say to anybody who's struggling with anything, take time for yourself to be with God, to get nourished by Him, get nourished by His word, and things will start to fall into place, and you'll start to see your way through.
I love that. Well, thank you for sharing parts of your story. I'm sure there are lots other things that we could talk about. Yeah. So you have a website, right? Your website is what, worshipwalkministries.com, or?
Yes. Yes. If you type that in, you'll come up on the WordPress site for that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for being here, and it was a pleasure talking with you.
Well, Lori, thank you. And thank you for what you're doing. I've been listening to some of your other episodes. It's just so encouraging and so important what you're doing. So I really appreciate the fact that you're doing this podcast.
Well, thank you for saying that, Heather.
Well, thank you for including me.
That was my pleasure. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss the different things that we have gone through. And I'll be here next week. I hope you are too.